Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is kind of a famous colloquium series, the Beck Group, and so it's really a pleasure to be here and have the chance to come here and talk about my research. What I'm going to do, so I think before I get started, there's a little bit of a, this is a behavior, evolution, and culture group, there's a little bit of a cultural difference that I think I need to kind of bring to your attention. I'm going to use life history theory today, and I'm going to use life history theory and apply it to development of reproductive strategies and health and so forth. I'm going to go through this. And when I study life history strategies, I'm a psychologist, I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm studying Western populations. And the way that we think about and study life history strategies is a little bit different from the way that anthropologists typically approach life history strategies, particularly in terms of thinking about the environment. Because anthropologists that are studying traditional cultures, the thing that is so fundamentally primary and center focus is energetics. It's all about energetic stress and energetic conditions. And life history models, and when you have when you have populations that are experiencing genuine energetic scarcity, and you have a proportion or much of the population that is undernourished, life history models look very different than when you're studying Western populations, where pretty much even almost everyone in your sample has enough calories. Even if they're very poor and they may be eating Hostess Twinkies, they may still have enough calories where you're not dealing with energetic stress so much as you're talking about environmental factors that come into play when energetics are adequate. So I just want to have that little prefatory note to kind of frame the models that I'm going to present today. Now, I'm going to talk about life history theory, and this is, let me just get the screen adjusted here. Okay, so life history theory, particularly developmental models of life history theory. And life history theory is a big picture developmental theory linking childhood experiences to sexual development, reproductive strategies, and health, the topic of my talk today. But really, this is the basic idea behind developmental approaches to life history theory, is that different developmental processes reflect ultimately different strategies that are adaptive under different developmental conditions. So it's really a theory of developmental programming and matching to ecological contexts. And today I'm going to apply this theory at multiple levels. I'm going to talk about the nature of ecological and family risk, and I'm particularly going to discuss the key distinction between harsh versus unpredictable family and extra-familial environments. I'm going to talk about the role of parental investment in regulating reproductive strategies, and particularly talk about the distinctive role and influence of fathers versus mothers on regulating particularly daughters' sexual development and related health risking behaviors. I am going to then, in talking about these processes, I'm going to talk about mediating mechanisms or intervening factors that may, that intervene between the exposures to stress or exposures to environmental contexts and development of reproductive strategies. I'm going to talk a little bit about weight and weight gain as a mechanism, and I'm also going to talk about stress physiology. And then I'm going to finish up by recognizing and talking about person by environment interactions, that it's a two-way street, that the person comes in there as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on biological sensitivity to context. I'm not really going to present the more recent instantiation of that work, which is the adaptive calibration model, other than just touch on it, because the adaptive calibration model is an entire talk in and of itself and can't really be folded into other things. Okay, so life history theory. Life history theory is a sophisticated evolutionary model of individual differences and developmental programming. And it is used to explain how individuals adapt their physiology, behavior, and reproduction to different social and ecological contexts. And really, in life history theory, the key concept is that of trade-offs. And to borrow a phrase from Steve Newberg, who likes to say, you can only spend a calorie one time. And if a calorie is spent here, it can't be spent there. And this is kind of the idea, or kind of a guiding idea behind life history theory, and that is that the amount of time and resources that individuals can devote to major life domains is limited. And within life history theory, when we talk about major life domains, we really tend to talk about three areas: growth, survival, and reproduction. So growth is building a bigger body and a better brain. It includes not just growing bigger, but also such things as play and learning and exercise and other activities that contribute to one's social and embodied capital. Then you have investment of resources in survival, which is all the things you do to stay alive. And then finally, you have investment in reproduction. And of course, you cannot maximize all of these components at once. You can only spend a calorie one time. You can only do so much. So we are selected to make trade-offs that actually prioritize resource expenditures, so that greater investment in one domain occurs at the expense of investment in other domains. So in thinking about, applying life history theory, you can think about trade-offs within developmental contexts. So let's take the developmental context of maternal undernutrition during pregnancy. The mother is undernourished. There's a limited amount of calories that are going across the placenta that are getting to the child, to getting to the fetus, and this forces a critical trade-off between growth and survival. And the fetus tends to respond to reduced nutrient supply by actually reducing anabolic demand. And in fact, the two best documented fetal growth promoting hormones are insulin, and so the fetus starts to produce reduced levels. You find reduced plasma concentrations of insulin. You also find lower plasma and tissue concentrations of IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor. And this reduction of these growth promoting hormones, it tends to result in a major redistribution of blood flow to protect the developing brain. And what you get under this context is you tend to get a reduction in fetal growth, a reduced lung and kidneys growth, or reduced size of the kidneys, reduced size of the lungs, reduced muscle mass, and it's necessary to allow the fetus to survive to birth and actually to protect the brain. So this is kind of a classic life history trade-off between growth and survival. Once a child is born, you can talk about many other different kinds of trade-offs. One more example I'll give here is a trade-off between survival and reproduction. So survival is investment of resources to allay mortality. So survival is investment in things like immune function and cellular DNA repair and pathogen and predator defenses. But in this context, resources that are spent on an inflammatory host response to fight infection cannot be spent on reproduction. Those calories are only spent one time, and the benefits of an inflammatory host response tend to be traded off against the costs of lower fertility. So what does all this add up to? What do these trade-offs add up to? Well, in a developmental context, each trade-off constitutes a decision node in allocation of resources, where each decision node influences the next, opening up some options for closing others in an unending chain over the lifespan. So this is Waddington's kind of famous epigenetic landscape where you have a ball rolling down the hill, and it's one representation of development where there's switch points in development, and you can go left, you can go right. And this is actually kind of a nice metaphor for thinking about life history, because every decision node is a trade-off. Whether you go left or you go right, whichever way you go, you gain something, you lose something. Maybe you preserve the integrity of the brain while sacrificing nephrons in the kidney. And that's what development is. So these trade-offs, when I say that's what development is, what I mean by that is that these trade-offs become instantiated in key developmental decisions over the life course. And these developmental decisions define alternative developmental pathways or life history strategies that are ultimately matched to the ecological context. So how do we actually think about these trade-offs? How do these trade-offs combine with each other? Well, one way to think about these trade-offs that's common in the literature is to capture them in terms of talking about fast versus slow life history strategies. Okay, so this is a figure that is loosely adapted from Belsky, Steinberg, and Draper, and it shows two different pathways. On the left here is a fast life history strategy, and on the right here is a slow life history strategy. And this fast life history strategy is adapted to a high stress context. Here you have high levels of poverty, marital instability, high stress and danger. Parents that are growing up in this environment tend to face demands that exceed their regulatory capacity. A lot of time and effort just needs to be put into staying alive. There's much less time left over for parental investment. They tend to pay the cost in this context, there tends to be a cost in terms of lower parental investment in offspring. Children growing up in this context are more likely to experience harsh, rejecting, insensitive, inconsistent parenting. Now, in the life history model, this level here, parental investment, is perceived as a conduit, essentially a signal about the larger external environment. So what the parents are doing are providing children information about the type of physical and social world that they're likely to mature in. And when they're experiencing low levels of parental investment and rejecting parenting, they're more likely to develop, in terms of psychological and behavioral development, they're more likely to develop in a ways that is matched to a high stress, high adversity context. They're more likely to develop an insecure attachment where they have, they don't trust other people, maybe develop more of an exploitive interpersonal style. In terms of executive functioning, you tend to see things like more emphasis on shifting attention rather than sustaining attention, with shifting attention being relevant to vigilance in your environment and going back and forth between different potential sources of threat or danger. You see more risky and aggressive behavior, more a focus on immediate gratification, get what you can now when you're in an environment where the future is uncertain. These changes tend to become biologically embedded. They can become biologically embedded in the individual's metabolism, in their neuroendocrine systems, in their autonomic systems, in their immune signaling. You see it in things like heightened sympathetic adrenomedulatory signaling, in things like glucocorticoid resistance, in gene expression profiles like pro-inflammatory cytokine gene expression. This is an immune profile that is essentially preparing the organism for wounding. In case, in a cut, as opposed to what you might see over here, which is more like antiviral immune response gene expression, which is preparing the organism for a whole different environmental context. Organisms growing up in this context, again, this is presuming that they're adequately fed, that there's enough calories to support growth and reproduction, tend to develop in a manner that accelerates reproduction, develop in a manner that accelerates puberty, sex, and reproduction. This is characterized by higher mating effort, less parental effort, less somatic effort, less effort in building a big and healthy body, and health costs down the stream in terms of lower physical and mental health. Now, in this fast track, individuals don't spend a lot of time preparing healthy meals and exercising and pursuing higher education because these things have opportunity costs. And in the fast track, it's important to avoid those opportunity costs. You avoid these costs to maximize short-term benefits, focusing on such things as mating and enhancing social status, often through risky and aggressive behavior. Now, over here, in the slow life history strategy, you just have the other side of a coin. And of course, these things are a continuous distribution, so this is having a fast versus slow is just a heuristic representation. But on the slow side, you have more of a stable, predictable environment supporting higher quality parental investment and more long-term orientation, which also becomes biologically embedded, later sex and reproduction, more parental effort, somatic effort, higher physical and mental health. Okay, so from this life history perspective, this life history perspective is very much emphasizing adaptation and context. What we think of, what we might commonly think of as, quote, bad parenting, in this theory, it directs or regulates development towards strategies that are adaptive under stressful conditions. And what we think of, quote, as good parenting tends to guide development towards strategies that are adaptive under stable, supportive conditions. So this is really about moving beyond value judgments towards understanding adaptation and context. And from this perspective, the adolescent who responds to an unstable or stressful family environment by developing an insecure attachment or adopting an opportunistic interpersonal style or engaging in a range of externalizing behaviors or sustaining early sexual debut, that adolescent is no less functional than an adolescent who responds to a stable and supportive social environment by developing the opposing characteristics and orientations. It's just very different cost-benefit trade-offs. Okay, now I'm going to come back and I'm going to go through this model. I'm going to talk about different parts of it. So I want to start off talking a little bit about the ecological and family context. So what is it about the environment that is important in and around the family? What is it about kind of the extra-familial environment that is important? And what does the developing brain really pay attention to? Of course, this is not just an evolutionary question, it's a cultural question too. I realize that there's many anthropologists here who study very distinctive cultures and very distinctive environments, and I realize that I'm going to be a little bit brushing over that right now and talk about more generally what are relevant features of the environment. So this really, from a life history perspective, it really first off takes us beyond cumulative stress. And, in the world of human development, developmental psychology, what you commonly see are overarching stress models, cumulative stress, toxic stress, allostatic load. They have lots of different names, but they often involve adding up lots of different stressors. And the idea is that the more stressors the child is exposed to, the more the child's development will be compromised. But this cumulative stress perspective does not really focus on what about the environment is important. It doesn't really ask developmental adaptation to what is the relevant environment of the child. And life history theory delineates basic dimensions of environmental stress and explains why different types of childhood experiences matter, particularly in relation to development of life history strategies. Now, we conducted an extensive within and cross-species analysis, reviewing many different context of development and many different species. And from this analysis, we derived really two core dimensions of environmental risk. And one of those dimensions is environmental harshness, which is extrinsic morbidity and mortality. And that is, extrinsic morbidity and mortality refers to external sources of disability and death that are relatively insensitive to the adaptive decisions of the organisms. So when an environmental factor causes high extrinsic morbidity or mortality, then even prime-age adults suffer relatively high levels of disability and death. And the probability of a child or his or her parents and grandparents surviving able-bodied until that child reaches adulthood is greatly reduced. And higher levels of extrinsic morbidity and mortality are systematically associated with faster life history strategies. When the environment around you tells you you're going to die young, you tend to reproduce sooner. And one of the interesting cross-cultural or cross-national correlations is there's almost a perfect correlation between the average life expectancy in any given country and the average age of first birth. The shorter the life expectancy, the earlier the age of first birth. It's a perfect correlation. There's only one exception to that on the entire graph. There's only one country that doesn't fit. It's Israel, by the way. Okay, other than Israel, it's a perfect correlation, but life expectancy, death, extrinsic morbidity, mortality. In Western societies, the key indicators of extrinsic morbidity and mortality are socioeconomic status. And that is at every level, it's called the gradient. At every level of socioeconomic status, as you go up that level, as you go up or you go down, you see systematic changes in morbidity and mortality from virtually all sources. Now, secondly, in this analysis is the importance of environmental unpredictability. And environmental unpredictability refers to instability of familial and extra-familial conditions. It indicates essentially that current environmental cues cannot be trusted, and environmental unpredictability tends to mitigate against long-term strategies and investments. And in Western societies, when we actually study environmental unpredictability, we tend to study things like changes in the environment, such as parental transitions, changes in who your parents are, residential changes, job changes, things that are markers of indications or fluctuations in your environment. Okay, so here's just one example of a line of research that we've done kind of looking at this. So in this work, this was done in the NIH D Study, which is a large national longitudinal study. And here, in this context, environmental conditions were studied in the first 5 years of life. And this is environmental harshness here, which was operationalized as harsh environmental conditions. So it was operationalized as income to needs ratio, a commonly used measure of socioeconomic status. And down here, we had environmental unpredictability. And environmental unpredictability was this latent factor that involved a number of parental transitions. Basically, every time a divorce occurs, a parent moves out, a new parent moves in. Every time the parenting situation changes, it's a parental transition. We also looked at residential changes, and we looked at parental job changes, a measure of economic instability. In this work, we were looking at the extent to which this predicted an indicator of maternal quality, which was maternal depression, so the extent to which this predicted changes in maternal depression from 15 months to 54 months. And then we were looking at a measure of parental investment, which was maternal sensitivity. And then here, an indicator of life history strategy, which was number of oral and vaginal sex partners. And what you find in this research is that, as you'd expect, environmental harshness is important. Individuals that grow up under more harsh environmental conditions, it tends to undermine the quality of parental investment. You see less maternal sensitivity. You also see that both environmental harshness and unpredictability are predicting the growth of maternal depression, which in turn is modestly associated with maternal sensitivity. But then when you can look down here at the number, at a marker of sexual behavior. But what you see is a really interesting and robust effect of environmental unpredictability. And that is environmental unpredictability emerged as a unique predictor of each of these outcomes. So families that had more environmental unpredictability showed more growth in maternal depression. These families had lower levels of maternal sensitivity, an indicator of parental investment. They had more environmental unpredictability was associated with a higher number of oral and vaginal sex partners. So it was basically at each stage of this developmental process, it was environmental unpredictability was coming into play. And thinking about this, yeah.
When you say environmental unpredictability, are you talking about the social environment?
Well, yeah, we measured it. We measured it in terms of three. So it was a latent variable that included three different indicators. One was the number of parental changes, the number of parental transitions, so divorce, remarriage, et cetera. Second one was the number of residential changes, and the third was the number of parental job changes. So those three things kind of loaded together are a latent factor, and that was our measure of unpredictability. And that measure, since we developed it in this paper, it's been used quite extensively by Jeff Simpson with the Minnesota Longitudinal Study, and they have a lot of and they've published just a number of really interesting papers about the central role of early environmental predictability, particularly in the first 5 years of life, in risk for substance use, risk for antisocial behavior, risk for early reproduction, and so forth. So it's really proven to be a robust measure, always used, always controlling for socioeconomic conditions, and often mediated through quality of parental investment. So coming back to this idea of going beyond cumulative stress, from a psychopathology perspective, or the equivalent in evolutionary biology is sometimes referred to as a silver spoon perspective, the more stressors children are exposed to, the more their development is challenged. And in a psychopathology perspective, exposures to stress, in a cumulative stress perspective, it's like collapsing domino pieces going towards stress-related endpoints. It's just the more you're exposed to, the more your development is challenged in multiple ways. But from an evolutionary developmental perspective, biobehavioral development adjusts in different ways to different kinds of environmental stress. And there are unique effects of environmental predictability, in this case particularly, over the entire developmental trajectory. Okay, I want to just kind of move down and continue and talk a little bit about child rearing in infancy. So that was really focusing on some extra-familial factors or larger ecological contexts. Now, we can also ask the question, what parental cues are important? What is it the parents do is important, and also what information is conveyed by maternal versus paternal behavior. Remember, in this model, quality of parenting is a kind of signal, it's a conduit that's communicating something to the child about the larger environment. Is what mothers are communicating versus fathers are communicating, is that different? Does it provide unique information to the child? Now, Draper and Harpening, many years ago, wrote a very influential paper on father absence and development of reproductive strategies that really focused on the signaling function of paternal investment. And they argued that across and within human societies, paternal investment is much more highly variable than maternal investment, and that in that context, it provides a high signaling value. And in their original paper, they argued that it's diagnostic of male reproductive strategies in the local ecology, and particularly the likelihood of future paternal investment by mates. They also argued that it was indicative of the sensitivity of offspring, quality, and survival to variation in parental investment. So this led to a lot of work looking at potentially the unique role of fathers in regulating children's strategies. Now, kind of building on Draper and Harpening's early work, we developed what we call paternal investment theory. And paternal investment theory is this idea, it posits a unique and central role for the quality of paternal investment in the regulation of daughter's sexual development, separate from the effects of other dimensions of psychosocial stress and support in the child's environment. So in this theory, fathers provide a unique source of information that daughters use to calibrate the reproductive strategy. It's not just fathers present versus absence, but it's also the quality, what fathers are doing in the home, the quality of their investment. And it also includes not just fathers, but also mothers' reproductive strategies and mothers' behavior in relation to men. And this theory posits different effects for fathers versus mothers, but specifically on daughters as opposed to sons' reproductive outcomes. Now, in kind of an early test of this model and some of the early work that we did, we simply started out looking at father absence and rates of sexual activity in teenage pregnancy. And in this work, we created three groups of father absence versus presence. We had early father absent girls, where a divorce had occurred or the parents were separated and the father was out of the home by the time the girl was age 5. And then we had late father absence, where he was present through the first 5 years, but he left the home sometime between ages 6 and 13. And then we had father present girls, which we defined as the father being present all the way up to at least age 13. We were studying early sexual activity, so we wanted to finish off our measurement of father absence by the onset of the teenage years. So what we had here, these are both large community studies, the United States and New Zealand, and you can see very similar findings. If you look here, this is rates of early sexual activity, which was defined as consensual sexual activity before the age of 16. And you can see in both the United States and New Zealand, girls from early father absent homes, about 60% of them were having early sexual activity. From late father absent homes, it was around 40%. And from father present homes, it was around 25 to 30% of girls were engaging in what we would define as early sexual activity. You can see here, these were the rates for teenage pregnancy. And again, you can see very strong effects of father presence and amount of father presence. So in these early father absent homes, in the US, you were getting 35% of the girls were getting pregnant before age 19. Here in New Zealand, it was 25%. And you can see, just kind of these kinds of linear relationship, that for late father absent girls, it was around 10%, and for father present girls, it was around 5%, or a little bit under 5% in New Zealand. Okay, so this showed a strong, basically zero-order correlation between the amount of father absence and these two, major indicators of early sexual activity of a fast strategy. So both of these studies were really focused on looking at childhood stress. They were life course adversity studies. They were very carefully measuring all kinds of things about the child's experiences. They were looking at the quality of parental investment they were receiving versus, warm, sensitive versus harsh rejecting. They were looking at the kind of neighborhoods kids lived in. They were looking at socioeconomic conditions. They were looking at race and ethnicity. And here is what the findings look like after you control for all those things. So if you put in all of these very detailed and extensive measures of early life stress and adversity, what you find out is that in the United States, this relationship hardly changes at all. It looks almost exactly the same. So it didn't really matter whether girls were rich or poor, whether they were black or white, whether they came from good neighborhoods or bad neighborhoods, whether they had warm investing parenting or low investing parenting. You still saw this essentially the same relationship between the amount of father absence and these indicators of sexual activity. In New Zealand, the quality of family environment measures, they made a difference. The environment the relationship weakened, but it was still the same. You still saw a statistically significant change even after controlling for all of these things. Okay, so that was looking at early sexual. So that was a very that was a very robust effect of fathers, very robust effect of the father's presence in the home. Now here, in this work, we've been looking at the relationship between father's investment in the first 5 years of life and daughter's pubertal timing. And so here we're kind of moving beyond whether or not the father was present or absence, but we're looking at some measures of the continuous quality of father investment. Here, this was father presence versus absence, a measure which we had in everyone in this study. Here, this was a behavioral observation measure. This is for the fathers that were present in the home. This was a direct behavioral observation measure of the quality of their warmth and interaction with their daughters. This is around dinner time observations. This is the time spent by the father in child care within biologically intact families, so in families where the father's living there, how much time did he spend taking care of the kids? And this is time spent by the father in child care within intact families that endured throughout the daughter's lifetime, throughout her childhood to that point. Okay, so what you get here is first you get an effect of father absence, and many people have studied this and found this type of effect where father absence is associated with more, this is daughter's level of pubertal development in 7th grade. Father absence was associated with more pubertal development, more maturation at that age. What you see here is that more observed father-daughter affectionate positivity, this is in the first 5 years of life, was associated with less pubertal development. Time spent by the father in child care was associated with less pubertal development, and that effect even got a little bit larger when you restricted it to the number of fathers who were there throughout, who had been there throughout the daughter's entire life up to that point in 7th grade. So you can see here, that in this research, that it's not just affecting a well-studied behavior, it's also affecting an important measure of physiological development, which is pubertal maturation. And I should say that puberty was measured in terms of both mother and daughter reports on a pubertal development scale. So it's ratings of things like pubic hair development and breast growth, and basically questionnaire measures of Tanner stages. And there's high agreement between mothers and daughters on the levels of pubertal development. Girls in the 7th grade suggesting some validity to these measures. Okay, we also did a comparison looking at the quality of maternal, these were the behavioral observations. And so we had measures of the quality of mother-daughter affectionate positivity, just like we had of the fathers. We also have mother-daughter coercive control. We have father-daughter coercive control as well. It didn't predict anything, so it's not in this model right here. And we did a hierarchical regression, and you can see that as well as the quality of father-daughter, that the quality of more warm and close mother-daughter relationships were associated with less pubertal development in the 7th grade, but even controlling for the quality of mothers, you find that the quality of father-daughter relationships, the father-daughter affectionate positivity also predicted less pubertal development in the 7th grade. So this was consistent with paternal investment theory. Paternal investment theory is not saying that mothers are not important. It's saying that there's a unique effect, a unique role of fathers in influencing or regulating daughter's sexual activity and daughter's sexual development. And here in this regression, we found this unique effect. Okay, so in summary, more warm, positive family relationships in early childhood were associated with later pubertal development in daughters, and the quality of father-daughter relationships emerged as the most important feature of the early childhood environment in relation to subsequent timing of pubertal development in daughters. Most important in that it had the largest effect. Okay, so when I did this work, all these studies that I presented were all descriptive longitudinal studies. They're all studies that were measuring children over time. Quality of family environments were measured pre-pubertally, typically in the first 5 years of life. Pubertal and sexual activity were measured later, so they had a longitudinal component. We pretty much know that pubertal development was not itself causing the quality of family relationships because of the longitudinal nature of these studies. But nonetheless, this research could not rule out third variables. And every time that I would write a paper on this, my discussion section would have to say the same thing about this is a longitudinal relationship. It's very interesting, but there could be third variable confounds. There could be genetic confounds that we're not accounting for. They're explaining both variation in fathering and variation in sexual development. There could be some unmeasured environmental confound. And this was always a vexing issue, and one that I had no solution for a long time. And after pounding my head against the wall for many years, I came up with a method to try to get at this, which is taking advantage of a natural experiment. And this natural experiment uses a sibling comparison methodology. And what I do is I do something very specific in this research. And that is I attempt to find families that have at least 2 daughters that are several years apart in age. And the 2 girls, the 2 sisters, have to have the same parents. They have to have the same biological mother, and they have the same biological father. But then they've experienced a divorce. And maybe the younger sister was 5 and the older sister was 12 when the divorce occurred. So the younger sister had 7 more years of exposure to father absence, and the older sister had 7 more years of exposure to father presence. So within these families, within these full biological sibling pairs, we're able to look at differential exposure to father absence. And this is actually a controls for shared environmental confounds because sisters in the same family, they're the same socioeconomic status, they're the same race, they're the same religion. A lot of the things that differ between families do not differ between these sisters in the same family. It also controls for genetic confounds because not that sisters are not genetically different from each other, but genetic differences between sisters are randomly distributed in relation to birth order. Older sisters as a group are not at greater genetic risk for anything systematically than younger sisters as a group. That's random. So it controls for both of these things. So we collect these sisters. I just finished collecting 240 sister pairs that fit this description. They're very hard to find. It took us 2 years to get 240 pairs. We'll see what that comes. But this is earlier research that was done. So in this work, one of the things we're looking at was simply what you have here on the x-axis is quality of paternal investment. So I'm interested in the relationship. I'm interested in this larger question about does differential exposure to father presence versus absence, and not just father presence versus absence, but father quality. Because it's not just, you might ask, it's not just whether the father is, would it work to have a cardboard cutout of the dad sitting on the couch, and that would be, qualify as father presence, or is it actually dependent on what he does? And a lot of our research suggests that it depends on what he does. So we're looking at differential exposure to fathers, and we're also looking at the quality of paternal investment. And here is a measure of the quality of paternal investment. And here is a measure of risky sexual behavior over here, which is like unprotected sex and number of sexual partners and sex after getting drunk and things like that. And we're looking at to what extent does higher quality paternal investment is it essentially protective against risky sexual behavior? And what you have here are, these lines represent older versus younger sisters. And we have 2 groups here. We have older versus younger sisters that have a large age gap. That's the blue line there. That's the older sister, and then the younger sister there. So those 2 have about an average 8-year difference in their age. They had an average of 8 years difference in their exposure to their fathers. Whereas these lines, where these 2 here are older and younger sisters with a small age gap, they have about an average of about 3 years difference. And what you get here is when you compare the older versus younger sisters with a large age gap that are maximally different in their exposure, you find that the older sister, who basically spent her whole childhood living with her father, for that older sister, higher quality paternal investment, more paternal warmth, more paternal investment was associated with less risky sexual behavior. But for her younger sister, who spent very little of her life living with her father, the line was flat. So this was an attempt to do a genetically informative analysis using this kind of multi-level modeling approach. And just to kind of sum up, what these data showed was that given a large age gap between sisters, more exposure to higher quality paternal investment was protective against risky sexual behavior in older daughters, but not younger daughters. But no such effect occurred in families with a small age gap between sisters. And so this tends to support or be consistent with a causal effect, and showing that the impact of paternal investment depended on dosage. Now, it's interesting, as a fathering researcher, you often attempt to, you're often interested in the fact, is there some special benefit of like really high quality fathering? Is the quote unquote super dad have some special effect on their kids? And as fathering researchers, it's often, you're often looking for those effects and thinking, oh, maybe those will be there. And time and again, one tends to be disappointed because they're very hard to find. And what you can find, what's easy to find, is it's easy to show the bad effects of really bad or abusive fathering. It's much more difficult to show the good effects of really special fathering. And that was true of this research as well, that this effect analysis revealed that it was primarily driven by variation around the low end of paternal investment that accounted for the effects of risky sexual behavior, that it was really differential exposure to abusive fathering. Okay, so coming back to this model, what I've done so far is I've talked a little bit about the family and ecological context. I've talked about, parenting and some of their effects on reproductive strategies. Now, it's really important to also think about what are the mediating mechanisms, what are the intervening processes through which these environmental exposures may actually affect our reproductive strategies and development. And so some of our work has also focused on this mediation question, particularly looking at stress physiology and weight gain as two mechanisms. So this is the kind of study, this is just an example, this should be starting to look kind of familiar. This group of variables and environmental measures taken early in life. Here pubertal development measured around the 5th grade. And so in this kind of work, that is guided by a life history perspective, what you're finding is that these early childhood measures, you have socioeconomic status, you have measures of things going on in the home. You have down here is a measure of parental investment. This is the quality of parental supportiveness. Up here you have kind of a more general family measure, marital conflict and depression. Those things tend to load together. Over here we had mother's age of menarche, which was a kind of genetic control. And what you found is that, and this again here was pubertal development in the 5th grade. And this was in a study, this was a Wisconsin study of families and work. And what you found was that, this is a fit path model, so these are standardized regression coefficients that you're looking at. And what you found is that there were significant effects of several different variables on pubertal development. So as you might expect, mothers that had later age of menarche, mothers at a later age of menarche, their daughters in the 5th grade actually showed less pubertal development. So, it's a kind of genetic control. Here you have a measure of socioeconomic status. And what we were finding is that girls, consistent with this kind of life history model in well-resourced environments or well-fed environments, higher socioeconomic status was associated with less pubertal development. Kind of replicating our earlier work, and it's always good to replicate it because a higher quality parental investment, more parental supportiveness was associated with less pubertal development. So this is another longitudinal study of that effect. And then you also had marital conflict and depression, which was working indirectly. So in this work, in the 3rd grade, we had measures of BMI, which is simply a measure, body mass index, a measure of how much girls weigh for their height. And as is very well documented, girls with higher BMI, here measured at about age 8, showed more pubertal development in the 5th grade. So being heavier for your weight, pre-pubertally was actually associated with more pubertal development. But we also found an indirect effect of marital conflict and depression. So this factor here was operating through BMI. So girls that were growing up in more stressful homes in terms of having parents that were fighting with each other a lot and parents who were depressed, those girls tended to put on more weight, they tended to be heavier, and that had an indirect effect on pubertal development. So you can kind of thinking about this of growing up in a very stressful home. When your parents are fighting while stressed in your home, you're probably not running to the refrigerator to grab carrots and celery. This is much more of a context where you're going and thinking about getting brownies or comfort food, and there's a whole literature about family stress and eating. And so this is one potential mechanism that we've developed and have continued to look at. In addition to looking at weight as a mechanism, we've also looked at stress physiology as a mechanism. And this is a major focus of my current work. This is the adaptive calibration model. I'm not going to go into the adaptive calibration model now because it's long and complicated, but let me just say that it is a model that attempts to look at the stress response systems of things like cortisol and autonomic functioning as a mediating mechanism operating in between these environmental exposures and development of life history related traits. Okay. So that's just touching on a couple of mediation questions, but also when you look at this figure, I actually very purposely have bidirectional arrows here because it's not just a one-way street from environment to child rearing to behavior. There's also child effects and there's person by environment interactions. The quality of child rearing is influenced by the physical and behavioral development of the child. Autonomic signaling. All these arrows go both directions. So there's this very complex gene by environment interactions, and there's moderating effects. And so this has led me to ask the question about, for whom does this model apply? Is this, thinking about this life history model is really an environmental developmental programming model. It's really about environmental influences and development of reproductive strategies. But we all know that, these are not large effects, and these effects may not always apply. They may be bidirectional. What do we do with this? Well, in trying to look at this question, this has kind of brought me to the topic of differential susceptibility, or talking about that individuals may differ in their actual openness or susceptibility to environmental influence. And this was really, this work was really stimulated by a simple finding. And that is the effect sizes of family context in predicting pubertal development and behavioral adjustment are typically small. And a possible explanation for these small effects is that children may be differentially susceptible to their family environments, and that the small main effects may actually overestimate the impact of rearing environments in some children and underestimate it in others. So this basic idea led us to really start thinking about biological sensitivity to context. And biological sensitivity to context is a concept that I developed with Tom Boyce. We originally published this in 2005, and we defined biological sensitivity to context as an enhanced neurobiologically mediated susceptibility to both risk-promoting and development-enhancing environmental conditions. So in this work on biological sensitivity to context, we defined neurobiological heightened reactivity in terms of the stress response systems. So we defined biological sensitivity to context in terms of heightened reactivity of the sympathetic, parasympathetic, or adrenocortical system. And in this work, we actually bring children into the laboratory. We expose them to a set of standardized laboratory stressors, where they may be doing a puzzle they can't solve, or they may get, or a smoke alarm may go off, causing a loud noise, and we actually have them hooked up to electrocardiographs and other recording equipment. And we attempt to measure the extent to which they are showing biological reactivity to these environmental challenges. And we have argued in this work that biological sensitivity to context is a central mechanism of plasticity. That is, that it regulates alternative patterns of human development, and that sensitive individuals are more likely to experience developmental change in response to environmental conditions in a for better and for worse manner. Now, in trying to actually develop this idea, we suggested the metaphor of the dandelion and the orchid. Now, dandelion child is actually a Swedish expression. And it's an expression the Swedes use to kind of describe a classically resilient child. A dandelion is a flower that grows in the cracks of a sidewalk. If any of you have ever done lawn care, you'll kind of see the dandelions come up in your lawn. You get there with your mower, you think you got him, you mow it down. The next day, the dandelion pops right back up. It's not beautiful. It's not anything that special to look at, but it's a tough flower. Good conditions, bad conditions, it can seem to survive in a wide range of conditions. Now, you can actually, as a counterpoint to that Swedish expression of the dandelion child, we invented the metaphor of the orchid child. Now, an orchid is a flower that, well, let me just say, I have a grandmother who's 100 years old, and she lives in Florida. And my 100-year-old grandmother grows orchids in her living room. And under my grandmother's care, her orchids have just, in her living room in Florida, they have just the right amount of light and humidity and moisture and salinity and heat. And under her care, her orchids develop into flowers of unusual beauty and delicacy. But if you took that same orchid and you put it in my living room in Arizona, it would almost immediately enter an emergency life history phase. It would drop its leaves, it would drop its flowers, it would basically start to wilt and start those falling domino pieces towards its stress-related endpoint. And so we actually use the orchid as a metaphor, as an orchid child, as a metaphor to describe a child that, given good conditions, given high-quality parental investment, given a good teacher, given good resources, could develop into an exceptionally successful child, a child who could be highly competent, a leader who could show health and thrive in various ways. But that very same child, given more harsh and unpredictable conditions would be most susceptible, most vulnerable to showing to actually wilting and fading, kind of like in the orchid analogy. And when we actually study this concept of orchids versus dandelions, we study it, we measure it by bringing children in the laboratory, and again, exposing them to these laboratory stressors. And here, and we always kind of measure this the same way. We always kind of set this up the same way. We always do these studies where something about the environment is always on the x-axis here. And here the environment is marital conflict, going from low conflict to high conflict. And there's always some child developmental outcome over here on the y-axis. There's always something about child development. And so here it's externalizing behavioral problems. To what extent is the child, externalizing refers to things like fighting and shouting and biting and hitting, all those things that 5-year-olds can do that you can easily measure. And we're asking to what extent does exposure to marital conflict predict more externalizing problems? But actually from the orchid dandelion perspective, it's for whom does it predict more problems? And here, these analyses are actually showing, are measuring biological sensitivity to context in terms of parasympathetic reactivity. These are asking kids that are showing strong vagal withdrawal or RSA measures to our environmental stressors. And here the solid lines are kids that we would actually model as being one standard deviation above the mean in parasympathetic reactivity. These are kids that we would call the orchid kids. And for these orchid kids who were modeled at high stress reactivity, you can see that under levels of high marital conflict, they show the most externalizing. Under low levels of marital conflict, they show the least externalizing. They have the best outcomes, the worst outcomes, depending on their environmental context. This dotted line are kids that we modeled at a standard deviation below the mean in parasympathetic reactivity. These are kids that showed very little vagal withdrawal to our stressors, or actually showed vagal augmentation for those that are in the stress physiology work and know what that means. And these kids that we call dandelion kids, high marital conflict, low marital conflict, it did not really matter. They showed about the same level of externalizing conflict. It was kind of like water off a duck's back. Here, just here's the same idea. Here it's a measure of overall family adversity, going from low adversity to high adversity. And here it's what you might call a positive outcome, school engagement. And again, looking at parasympathetic reactivity, RSA, a measure of parasympathetic reactivity. These are our orchid kids with high reactivity. You can see that high family adversity, they show the lowest school engagement. Low family adversity, they show the highest school engagement. They have the best outcomes or the worst outcomes depending on that context. Whereas these dandelion kids, they look relatively flat across context. So this is really the story of the orchid and the dandelion. And not all the data are this clean. I'm naturally presenting you good examples of these data. But the basic idea behind biological sensitivity to context is that the very qualities that traditionally, or at one time, we thought of as children's greatest frailties, being high in physiological reactivity to stress, being high in negative emotional reactivity, these very things that we thought of as children's frailties can also be their greatest strengths given the right context. So with this biological sensitivity to context idea in mind, we came back to these data. We wanted to look further at this relationship. We found here that children that had that experienced more supportive parenting when they were in preschool, that about 8 years of age, about 4 or 5 years later, that they showed less pubertal development. But it's a negative 0.22. Regression coefficients is not very big effect. And could it be that, well, that's true for some kids and not for others, that there's a sensitivity to context effect? So we essentially went and we reanalyzed these data. And these kids were, again, all these kids were brought into the lab and went through this protocol. And here, the measure of pubertal development is spread out. So it's centered at age 12. So 0 represents age 12 and a half. So this shows pubertal development in kids from basically -3, from 9.5 to 15.5. This shows that, that is pubertal, and there's pubertal development actually at Tanner. That shows their Tanner stage, a level of pubertal development. Higher numbers indicate more breast development, more pubic hair development. And from age 9.5 to age 15.5, there's a basic fundamental law or fundamental truth. And that is puberty happens. So from age 9 to age 15, everybody goes through puberty. Okay, it doesn't matter. But we were asking, and this is a piecewise growth curve analysis, we were asking, for whom does it actually make a difference whether or not you're exposed to high or low levels of family supportiveness? And here we're using a measure, this is focusing on a measure of sympathetic nervous system reactivity, so a little different than the parasympathetic measure. This is a PEP. But these solid lines show the children in our studies that we would call our dandelion kids. They were modeled at a standard deviation below the mean in sympathetic nervous system reactivity. And here, it doesn't really matter. Blue, they have low family support. Red, they have high family support. It doesn't really make a split of difference. They go through bump, 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 the same kind of systematic march through puberty as they get older. But when you look down here, when you look at these dotted lines, these show our kids that we would call our orchid kids. They were modeled at a standard deviation above the mean in sympathetic nervous system reactivity. And for these kids, you could see that when they had high support and low sympathetic nervous system reactivity, over here, high support and high sympathetic nervous system reactivity, these kids right here, they showed very little pubertal development from age 9.5 to age 12, and then they dramatically caught up. Whereas the kids that have, these kids here that had high sympathetic nervous system reactivity and low family support, right here, these kids showed the most accelerated pubertal development. So there was a main effect of parental, so there was a small main effect of parental supportiveness, as I showed you on the previous slide. There was no main effect of sympathetic nervous system reactivity, but significant interaction both in the initial slope and the level and also in the later slope. So you see that, so if you come back and ask this question, well, does the quality of family relationships actually potentially regulate pubertal tempo, how fast you go through puberty, and pubertal timing when you complete puberty? You got to ask that question, well, you ask for whom? And for whom it seems to be quite important for kids that are these orchid kids that show high biological sensitivity to context. Now, it's important to note that this kind of work, this work on biological sensitivity to context, is not only done using markers of stress reactivity. In our work, we focus on stress physiology, but other people, for instance, has looked at the same question, the relationship between quality of family environment and age at menarche, looking at genetic markers of sensitivity to context. Here, it was estrogen receptor alpha, ESR1, and they're showing that the different versions of this gene that pubertal timing only appears susceptible to family environment among individuals who were homozygous for the GG allele of this ESR1 polymorphism right here, and that other versions did not. So what I wanted to emphasize here, by showing this other work done by Steve Manick and colleagues, is that this larger concept of differential susceptibility, which biological sensitive context is part of this literature, is instantiated in multiple genetic polymorphisms and neurobiological mechanisms and behavioral phenotypes. Some people study it in terms of hippocampal volume. Some people study it in terms of temperament. But no matter what level you study it, people have been identifying these factors that operate as susceptibility factors, moderating the influence of environmental exposures on developmental and life outcomes. And if you want to just see, the main people that have kind of contributed or developed this idea were myself and Tom Boyce, but also Jay Belsky, Marion Baker Cranenberg, and Marinus van Eisendorn. And the five of us collaborated on what attempted to be a review paper on this topic. So if you want kind of an overview of this literature, you could try looking at this paper as a start. But this idea of differential susceptibility has far-reaching implications for understanding whether and how much child and adult development responds, for better and for worse, to the gamut of environmental conditions. And really, this is also, it's very much as telling you that, for instance, any kind of interventions that are trying to manipulate the environment, one size is not going to fit all. They're going to have very different effects on people depending on their biological sensitivity to context. Okay, conclusion. Okay, so today I presented an evolutionary developmental perspective on the effects of ecological and family conditions on pubertal development and risky sexual behavior. And I believe that this perspective challenges prevailing thinking about human development with regards to some contextual conditions and their sequels as being good or bad. And this life history theory and research provides an important framework, an important relevant framework for conceptualizing dimensions of environmental risk, for thinking about the effects of parental investment, including fathers, for understanding mechanisms of environmental influence, and also for conceptualizing person by environment interactions and development, such as differential susceptibility to rearing influences. Thank you. Yeah.
So a couple of sort of questions, future directions, kind of ideas. So one is, in pointing to the small effect size, you then went into the differential susceptibility idea of individual differences, which is clearly panning out. Another possibility, which you have probably entertained but didn't discuss here, is that paying attention to natal family cues alone is a very narrow source of information for the developing individual, right? So if you look at something like father absence, father presence, while it's true that by virtue of shared genetic composition, the offspring can take good cues from the parents as to, what strategies are optimal in a given environment. It's also the case that shit happens, right? That, that a tree fell on dad. Relying exclusively or primarily on a very small sample of information for the developing individual means being susceptible to small sample size effects with regard to the cue, right? So it could be that, and I realize that you've controlled for SES and that this doesn't make much difference and that kind of thing, but it may well be the case that something like the presence of fathers in intact nuclear families across the neighborhood, which, may correlate with SES, but certainly not perfectly, right? And within, say, poor communities, there are probably enormous differences between church-going families, for example, and those that are not, right? From the perspective of the developing individual, you might expect that that would be a particularly reliable cue because you're getting a bigger sample of information, right, as to whether there are dads or cads in the local environment. And so it's possible that you would get larger effect sizes if you broadened the cue, as it were, outside of the family of origin.
So you brought up a number of points, and I was just, it was interesting. I was just chatting with Brooke a little bit before I came over here, and she was telling me about some of the complexities in measuring paternal investment among the Himba, and I realized that this is a challenging topic. I tend to believe I tend to be of the opinion that quality of parental investment is an important cue, not the only cue, but that it is an important cue, and that there does tend to be a certain amount of intergenerational transmission of status and the niches and resources, available to you. Now, we certainly I don't mean to limit it to studying the quality of parental investment. We certainly try to think about larger ecological factors such as captured by constructs such as harshness and unpredictability. Although studying Western populations, the most practical and the most directly relevant way often is to study things that are linked to the family. In addition, another way of getting at this is thinking about mediating mechanisms. Because whatever the environmental cues are, if you can start to tie down how these cues are operating in terms of intervening processes, you can get a much stronger handle on it. And so particularly our work on the adaptive calibration model, which I did not present today, but as a whole is really looking much more at patterns of stress responsivity and interactions among different stress systems in regulating some of these outcomes, and they have very interesting environmental histories, including prenatal programming and yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Regarding the variation in biological sensitivity to context, so is there any work, theoretical or empirical, about the source of that variation? Is it due to fluctuating selection, or is it just noise, or?
Right. So there are different models regarding the sources of variation. So when you look at variation in stress reactivity, you can talk about different levels of variation. You can talk about variation in basal functioning, kind of the chronic level of activation. And studies of that suggest that tends to have quite a strong genetic component. in terms of your typical chronic resting levels. Then you can look at responsivity, which is the extent to which you're changing in response to stressors in your environment. And that tends to be much more looking like gene by environment interactions, in the sense it looks much more. So in the adaptive calibration model is a model about calibration of the stress response systems. And so there's definitely, there is a literature about developmental calibration of these systems. And these systems particularly seem to be, unstable quite early in life. And they don't have much retest reliability in, in infants or even in preschoolers. Still retest reliability is relatively low, and it gets, and they get more established as kids get older. We have basically, in our work on the adaptive calibration model, that model is basically suggesting that there's two kinds of orchid children and there's two kinds of dandelion children. And so it's basically arguing that you'll find high stress responsivity, that you'll find kind of a U-shaped curve where you'll have heightened stress responsivity in both very supportive and very stressful environments where it's serving kind of different functions, but that there's also different cases, different factors that lead to low stress responsivity as well. So yes, there is definitely developmental work and there's developmental models, and they're probably too complex to really try to summarize in a question, although I'd be happy to give another talk, bring up the adaptive calibration model talk and take you through that. But we tend to think those effects are complex and that they're massively nonlinear. And so we've been using a lot of nonlinear methods to try to look at how stress responsivity varies across different developmental conditions. Yeah, Andrew.
Bruce, I appreciated sort of the discussion of getting away from good versus bad parenting,
Yeah.
and how sort of the public health, both financial and social emphasis of the research up to this point wants to think of it that way. So, but at the same time, does that mean the counter argument that you're making is that the parenting is always going to be equally good? It's just good for whatever environment in which you find yourself. And if that's the case, what do we make of sort of emerging evidence that high stressful circumstances can compromise emotional regulation or decision-making? Thus, it could be that those in the different environments, not that they're equally as good, they're actually even compromised in trying to be good parents, even in the environment in which they are. They're perhaps less able to deal with cues, deal with a difficult infant, and all of these things. So,
Right. So this is kind of the $64,000 question that you just asked, and this is something that I struggle with a lot. And so this model is really arguing that different forms of parenting are preparing children for different types of environment. And I think a lot of the question that you just raised is kind of thinking, well, how can we I think that the underlying assumption that you may have there is that you may be thinking about how can we get children kind of out of these environments and get them maybe to function better in middle-class environments where long-term thinking will pay off. We're not thinking about what's best for them in an unpredictable environment where you may really want executive functioning that's focusing on shifting attention, and it may be a very bad idea to delay gratification and shoot for long-term goals. You're thinking about, well, if we could just get them out of that harsh, unpredictable environment and shift them over into a more stable middle-class world, what would help them function in that world? If we could improve if we can get them to have better inhibitory control, if we can get them to have more sustained attention, if we can get them to have more delay of gratification, they'll do better in this middle-class world that we value. And I agree with that. They probably would. But what this is arguing about is adaptation and context. And so one of the questions that no one asks, the question that virtually no one asks is what are kids that are growing up in these high-risk environments actually good at? What does it make you good at remember? What kind of memories does it enhance? What kind of problem solving does it enhance? Whether it's deception detection, or shifting attention, or whatever it may be. And so it really depends a lot on what kind of world you're going to prepare them for and to what extent you can shift them. I think that there is an alternative to trying to get them ready to do well in a middle-class world where you're promoting, emotion regulation and inhibitory control. There is an alternative of trying to study what are the actual skills that are enhanced by high stress environments and how can we actually work with instead of against those skills to actually enhance their functioning. I just very recently published a paper, an intervention paper called The Meaningful Roles Intervention, that attempts to present this alternative view of intervention, for example. So I recognize what you're saying. I mean, I recognize what you're saying, but I think that it's a complex question, and I think you got to ask for in what context does it benefit them.
Yeah, sure, I agree, it's very much a possibility. A lot of those tasks that are being used are definitely normed for survival in this sort of enriched environment. But it also, it sort of behooves the theory, right, as you were saying, so I guess I'm just putting an exclamation point that, to have the task, in order to test that it's, that being strategic within that high stress environment, we need a task that actually will differentiate those individuals than other individuals who are not in that environment, in their ability, either in their parenting, awareness, and responsivity for that environment as compared to a different environment for the child.
I agree that it would take different measures and a different way of thinking than developmental psychologists have typically thought.
If I could just add a footnote to that, I think it's, particularly for students listening to this exchange, what may be opaque is that part of the issue is what the desirable outcome is seen as being. So from a social perspective, the desirable outcome may be antithetical to that which the developed system aims at in terms of a fitness-enhancing response in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So it could well be that, that what looks like pathological dysregulation in contemporary, 21st century American society of, say, emotional responses and corresponding parenting behaviors is, in regard to adaptive functioning in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, a very effective behavioral intergenerational transmission of a strategy that works for a given environment. So when we talk about good, and put it in scare quotes there, you need to be pretty careful about what you mean as good. And it's often going to be the case that what is adaptive or was adaptive in the past is not at all in what society sees as either desirable or even in the interests of the individual.
In that regard, you didn't really describe your sample very much.
Okay, because talked about a lot of different
Ethnicity,
samples. Yeah.
Homeless, did you exclude developmental disabilities?
Right. Well, I presented a bunch of different studies here as kind of giving an overview of this idea and kind of the work that I've done in this area. Some of the studies, so it was widely variable. Some of them were fairly representative community samples. Some of them were oversampling poverty and low SES. And so the study, the Wisconsin study, had a lot of white people that ate a lot of cheese and had a lot of BMI. But that's Wisconsin. The study in New Zealand was very much a cohort study, a population cohort study. Another one of the U.S. studies that I was presenting was a low SES, high adversity, high African American sample. And then the sister studies are their own piece in and of themselves as well. They're more diverse samples as well. So there wasn't really one other than the common thread was that they were Western samples. Most of them were fairly representative community samples.
I mean, for one factor, if in a father, you could have father absent in a more matrilineal culture where the grandmother is playing an important role and then the father is less relevant.
Right. So, yeah. So there is this. There is an anthropological perspective, and actually, the Draper and Harperdings obviously are, of course, are anthropologists, and so they did try to link paternal investment to ecological conditions, and so they make the observation that you're more likely to find biparental investment in harsh ecological conditions that really require two parents to raise the child. Of course, that could potentially come from a grandparent as well. So there's a lot of things involved in that. Obviously, parental certainty is important. The potential impact of fathers on the child's health and survival, given the ecological context you're in, is important as well as the reliability of the signal. So yeah, it's, that's complicated. I don't have a really, strong answer to that.
But your point, I really agree that the skills that I had for, in school, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, I would not have served me well in an, really poor inner city gang infested neighborhood.
Yeah.
I'd like to address the earlier point about what's the potential good in these other vast life history strategy. And somebody, at least one person, did address that point. In fact, in this very room, AJ Figueiredo was here a number of months ago and was talking about something else about vast life history trajectory type evil, which has not been so much. And that's the adaptability and the cognitive general ability of their approach to things. And this does correlate with things that we would regard as positive, things like resilience, grit, resourcefulness, adaptability, flexibility, learning new things, brand new things a little bit faster and easier, novelty, innovation. These are associated with those as well. So at least somebody is.
Right. So yeah, so of course, AJ is a collaborator of mine. He's from Arizona as well, and so I'm very familiar with his thinking about life history strategy. And so there is an attempt, there is emerging research that's trying to understand kind of what are adaptations to stress and what are they good for. So for instance, there's work, I mentioned shifting attention, and there's work by Vladis Griskavicius and his students looking at shifting attention versus sustaining attention ability. And he has some interesting experiments showing that low SES individuals that are, when you experimentally in a randomized assignment expose them to economic unpredictability, that they actually become better at shifting attention. And they actually become better than individuals from low risk, higher SES environments. When they're experimentally exposed to current unpredictability, they become worse at shifting attention. You actually see a bifurcation, whereas under control conditions, they look similar. And so we've been trying to think about, from an intervention perspective, what is shifting attention good for? And one, shifting attention is really the ability to unstick your attention from one thing and shift it to something else. And so theoretically, shifting attention should actually facilitate associative learning. And it should make you better at learning certain types of things that involve, unsticking your attention and making new connections. And so we've been testing its role in associative learning, thinking that if you could actually show a robust connection or show when or how those were associated, that would have direct implications for perhaps how to design educational and classroom environments for high-risk kids who are good at associative learning. Andrew, yeah.
Well, just to add on that, there's another model, and I know you're familiar with this work, having to do with adolescent decision-making literature, where a lot of the early work that came out, along with the emergence of work on brain development during adolescence, is that they're risk-taker, bad decision-makers. At the same time, risk-taking is a learning mechanism. That's how you learn. And there's emerging work that's coming out literally over the last 2 or 3 years to show that they are more flexible in many situations and can shift strategies and all these kinds of things, which also fits with a particular view of adolescence. So there is another model also of sort of developing tasks, perhaps, if this is critical, or emotion regulation games or tasks that sort of are better able to tap this precise kind of hypothesis of your.
And that would work with those skills, not against them. Thinking about how to design educational, how to design classrooms or learning environments that would actually work with these adaptations. Brooke, yeah.
So, I'm just thinking about that idea of this relationship that you have with your father as being a signal of what you're gonna expect when you're out on the mating market later on, right? As opposed to a more direct route where if you're in doesn't have to be a matrilineal society, but maybe if you're in this sort of unstable kind of environment, then the direct support you may still continue to get from your father when you come back. may be really important. So like you have these kind of unstable romantic relationships yourself, and so it's important to know that you can come home to your natal family for support. And so I'm just thinking about the difference between men's stability in their relationship with their romantic partners, with their wives, versus the stability in their relationship with their daughters, and how that may affect the daughters' decisions. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm not. So this kind of, I mean, it a little bit taps into the question that Dan brought up earlier about what, and this is a larger question about what you should pay attention. Well, one is the question about what you should pay attention to, because there's a million signals in your environment, and which signals are actually important. Mm-hmm. And so, paternal investment theory is suggesting that there's some unique information provided by the father that is going to have a unique signal that is relevant in terms of calibrating reproductive strategies. Now, I think what you're saying is that it's not, maybe another way to think about it is going beyond a signal. Maybe it's not,
it's a signal of the future investment you can expect from your father, as opposed to a signal of the stability you can
in terms of your future resources you would expect. So how would that, so if I was to turn this around to you, how would that empirically, what would that look like? How would you differentiate those two things?
So I think you'd have to track investment across, like beyond adolescence, like the strength of this father-daughter relationship over time, as opposed to, I mean, typically we sort of, that pubertal development or age at first birth or something seems to be sort of the final outcome measure, right? As opposed to looking at how early paternal investment correlates with later paternal investment, which would be a different outcome, maybe. So.
Right, but that would still be definitely part of the original Draper and Harperding theory. That would be part of the investment of the strategy that's being calibrated. Would be your own parental investment in the next generation.
It seems to me, Berkeley, it makes the opposite prediction from what the data show, which is, so if I'm daddy's girl, and I know I can always go to daddy for support, even a decade after maturation, right? Then I should be promiscuous, right? Because I don't need husbands, I got daddies, right? And the data say the opposite.
Right.
The data here say the opposite.
The data here definitely say the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about where I work, where it seems like if you have a father who has a lot of resources, and then you have more freedom to be able to divorce if you know that you have this home environment that you can go back to and rely on for resources. So.
Yeah, I would say, especially in in your field location, I would say divorce is probably not the variable to look at. It's total number of partners, right? Because promiscuity is not the same as marital stability.
But it's the move. I think it is about marital stability, and it's about the residential shift of being. So if you've moved to your marital home and you want to be able to know that you can leave that husband and have some place to come back to. So because if you're still married and you're cheating, for example, then you're still dependent on so that doesn't really affect paternal resources. So I think it is actually a resource.
I mean, part of the logic is, a lot of it is a timing logic. So that if you are, in a father-absent society where males are investing little, and like a classic example might be in, multi-generational female-headed households in the U.S., there's no reason to delay. I mean, if you're to depend on female relatives, on aunties and grandmothers to help you raise your offspring in a multi-generational female-headed household, there's no reason to delay. You might as well start sooner while they're still younger and healthier and are around. Whereas part of the logic behind paternal investment theory is that if you have grown up experiencing high levels of paternal investment, it's like a long-term orientation. It's like a slow life history strategy where you can afford to make a long-term investment in a relationship. You can expect to have a long-term investing partner who will allow you to produce a small number of high-quality offspring that will be competitive in your environment. So it's really that's the other side of it.
I think one of the disjunctures is that if you grow up in one of these sort of more matrilineal families, for example, in the U.S. or something, right, that once dad is gone, he's gone. Your relationship, when mom's relationship with dad is severed, your relationship is also often severed.
Or
So
reduced,
you're
or, yeah.
really significantly reduced, and in some cases maybe he was never really around that much or something, right? Whereas in other places, even if mom and dad have divorced, that doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship with your father and the expectation that you could go back to his home with his is as reduced, and so you can't, I don't know, I think that matters, because it's about this continuing dependence on dad as opposed to
Right.
dad as a cue of what you can expect yourself.
Right.
I mean, I haven't thought this through, it was, yeah, I started and then. Okay.
She timed it perfectly,
I
we're out of
timed-
time.
yeah.
Whoever's the last word. Okay.